In this class, we're going to start St. Thomas's first lesson in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics. Because we are going to cover so much material in this class, this video will, or the two videos will go over 1 hour, but I think you'll find them informative, and you'll understand the reason why these videos will have the length that they do. To start the class, I'm going to review, as I normally do, for a short time, what I discussed in video lecture 6, where in the Summa Theologia I covered St. Thomas's teaching about habits and virtues, the different varieties of law, spent some time on natural law, and I did that because these particular topics are a great segue into St. Thomas's teaching about what Aristotle is saying at the start of the Nicomachean Ethics, especially related to natural law, where St. Thomas talks about the need beyond natural law to have a civil law, why natural law is directed chiefly towards the human species, and why civil law needs to be enacted, and why all law needs to be promulgated, needs to be made public, so that people know that the governor or the chief leader of a community has the authority to use force because of a natural inclination on the part of human beings, on the one hand, to take direction from reason, to follow good legislation, and nonetheless somewhat to be resistant to it just by emotional disposition. His beginning to the start of the Nicomachean Ethics, his commentary, St. Thomas it mentions the different topics of discussion, how Aristotle is covering different types of ends related to the human good, the chief end of human nature, or our summum bonum. Within the context of doing this, he's going to talk, as Aristotle did, about two parts of the soul, and about virtue in general, not in detail. The discussion of natural law, I said, is a great introduction to this, especially what St. Thomas says about the responsibility of the wise man, where he says that because good habits perfect reason, and the science of wisdom is the perfection of reason, differentiation in sciences is caused by different habitual ways of considering modes of order, ways of being organized or perfected. In short, St. Thomas is maintaining that qualitatively different, higher, more powerful habits of knowing, different orders of perfection in ways of being organized by parts and wholes, is what constitutes the nature of science. Higher sciences know higher, more powerful causes in qualitatively higher, more powerful ways. Examples are physics, mathematics, and metaphysics, where in the lower sciences consider in a less extensive way what the higher science is going to consider. Even in mathematics in relationship to physics, you see that the person in physics will examine growth, for example, but so will the mathematician, and more extensively, because qualities that are externally observable in material are impacted upon by quantitative dispositions within a material that enable this to be more widely and more deeply known in a way by mathematicians. Now, I need to mention at this point that toward the end of his life, around 1272, 1273, St. Thomas is doing the second and third parts of his Summa Theologiae. I think it's those parts he's working on, if I recall correctly, and simultaneously writing numerous commentaries on Aristotle. And at the same time, a work has been translated by his translator William of Merbecki into the Latin. That's called the Book of Causes, which had been mistakenly identified as a work of Aristotle. It was actually a work of a 5th century Byzantine scholar from Constantinople named Proclus, and it was called The Elements of Theology. And St. Thomas recognized that this Book of Causes, whose author is unknown, but was a Christian, and this work had been mistakenly attributed to Aristotle as part of his Metaphysics, was actually using enormous amounts of material from this Elements of Theology. And in that work, the Book of Causes discusses the nature of causation, right? And especially how more powerful causes more deeply enter into their effects, that is, into the organizations they cause, and more widely impact upon their behavior. So I suspect that St. Thomas was able to recognize the import of this notion, which is also in Aristotle, but it probably stuck out more in St. Thomas's mind as he became aware of this work. I'm not requiring you to read that work, but I'm going to recommend it as a secondary source. Anyway, according to St. Thomas, the more powerful a cause, the more deeply and widely it enters into its effects. This is not something that mathematicians are going to recognize, for example. It's not something that engineers are going to recognize, because they don't focus attention on the nature of causality today. The chief interest in causality is for controlling it, regulating it, constraining it with technology so they can predict behavior. That's not helpful to people who want to understand the nature of causes as they impact on organizations from internally as well as externally, in qualitative ways that escape the notice of mathematicians. So if companies, if businesses, if schools, universities have as advisors people who chiefly study behavior from the standpoint of mathematics, they will never understand the nature of causation and how it impacts on organizations. According to St. Thomas, the act of existence is the most powerful generic cause in the universe, entering into all natures. Every other secondary, more specific cause naturally inclines to preserve the order of creation more deeply than it does the existence of its species. Every individual nature seeks to preserve the existence of its species more than it does its own individual existence. You might recall St. Thomas talks about the natural inclination in natural law for individuals toward self-preservation and preservation of species, and this other element in natural law to be concerned about the good of the universe, basically, the good of the whole of creation. Every individual seeks to preserve and perfect its own existence as an essential part of two higher orders of existence, the order of creation and its species. Every individual part of the universe is social by nature, according to St. Thomas. In the created order, he says that intellect, only intellect, the human intellect and reason, so far as we know, knows the order of one thing to another. And a twofold order exists in things, of parts to parts, and parts to a whole, and of the whole to an end through a highest part. This need for this highest part is important to understand because of the fact that the parts need to be harmonized to cooperate with one another, much like an orchestra leader. In creating harmonization within musicians is restraining activity, putting limits on the freedom of their behavior so that they can cooperate. The second order of the parts to the whole is one in which the actions of the whole and the parts are identical. It's a combined or cooperative action, and it constitutes numerically one act. St. Thomas gives it as an example of this, a whole army attacking an enemy and all of the parts of a crew rowing together. It's a single action, but it's cooperative. It's today what we call a corporate action. It resembles the way we would talk about corporations operating. The first order of parts to parts resembles departmental actions within companies in which the actions of this or that department do not constitute that of the whole corporation. St. Thomas maintains that different sciences study these two different species of order by means of different sciences. Within the divisions within ethics, for example, the study of ethics considered as a whole would be different from the study of individual human behavior, which St. Thomas says would be covered by the study called monastic, where we're talking about what's species specific as part of the natural human behavior for individual. Social acts, a different ethical study, would be the activities related to domestics or economics, meaning household management, and then the political activity, the science of politics, is a bigger whole still. All of them constituting parts of the subject of ethics. Considered as a whole to which all of these parts contribute is the science of ethics. Generically considered as a whole, St. Thomas claims that science has two widest dimensions: theoretical, speculative, or observational, and practical, which he divides into what I call performance activities or use, and productive activities, that is manufacturing. These sciences are hierarchically ordered. Science essentially involves different relationships among these habits. As Aristotle says, the science of use determines the science of production. The art of sailing governs the art of shipbuilding. The whole purpose of manufacturing is to produce instruments, enabling means for us to engage in personal activities, human actions. And they are naturally inclined to be subordinated to the perfection and to the health of those activities. Just as those activities, performance activities, are hierarchically arranged, so those that are goods of the body, the health of the body, are inclined to serve the health of the soul, or psychological health. That's why St. Augustine says a person would prefer to be sighted and sane rather than sightless and insane, by natural inclination. Now, according to St. Thomas, this inclination that human beings have to study order in things gives rise to a fourfold order in which human beings are interested in knowing about the world around us. I've mentioned these already at the start of the course. Contemplating part-whole relationships in things, for example, and then 3 practical activities: logic, ethics, and productivity. as well as performance activities, ethics and performance activities, logic, orders, verbal expressions, the performance activities, ethics, examine ordering the way our faculties cooperate one with each other, and the production is concerned with the manufacturing, the planning and manufacturing of external materials and goods like houses and so forth. In moral philosophy, St. Thomas claims the order to be studied, the organization we're studying basically, is voluntary action, the human will, as commanded by reason, following the order of reason. The subject of ethics is voluntary activity, ordered to a chief end, namely human happiness. Science by nature, since by nature, I should say, man is a social animal needing many things to live as a perfect rational animal in the present life. By perfect, St. Thomas means maturely developed. To be a perfectly whole organization, you need all your essential parts. They have to be provided for. He says, he lives as parts, human beings live as parts of different social groups that help us to live well. The first of these, is our species, which we live in by nature, but only as a result of being generated by a natural family, by the union of a man and a woman in marriage, or some sort of a union, at the very biological union at the very least. The natural family inclines by nature, he says, to provide generation, nourishment, instruction, including moral education to children, and to help children to provide for the necessities of life. In addition, human beings by nature are inclined to socialize in civic groups to help provide more than the necessities of life and to help provide moral education in a more complete way, because, as he said regarding natural law is insufficient to provide for moral education. It needs to be completed by divine revelation for St. Thomas, but also civil law. So civil law, according to St. Thomas, is necessary to come into being, to provide for moral education, for, among other reasons, fear of punishment to control children that parents cannot control. He speaks actually about young men. He might have been thinking about one or more of his brothers who were, he said, would have to spend some time in purgatory. Since the family is only one of several social groups to which human beings belong, ethics must study human activity as species-specific, that is, related to the individual, monastics, the family, domestic relations, and political or civic. So for St. Thomas and for Aristotle, ethics is chiefly a study of human socialization, developing habits that enable human beings to live peacefully together within social groups, social organizations, and in the city. It's a training in the habits of citizenship, chiefly. St. Thomas comments that consideration of the order, in Book 1, Aristotle explains what he will do in the other books. He states how practical sciences like ethics are diversified by diversity of ends and means. St. Thomas comments that consideration of order of ends and means is proper only to human reason. In practical matters, two principles are essentially involved in order, understanding order, reason, and execution. Reason and will. the two faculties involve reason, which engages in order and choice, and will in execution. Regarding moral activity, he says that this is the activity of an appetitive intellect, and moral education does not proceed like speculative. It essentially involves choosing right means to hierarchically ordered ends, and is secured through practice, not through lecture. The productive arts, in relationship to this, are ordered, are subordinated to performance arts, so as to provide for the human needs that we are attempting to secure through our human activities. Human happiness, politics, according to Aristotle, is in a way divided by principles like reason, will, and habit, and he talks about this in book 1. In Lesson 2, St. Thomas starts to specify the subject of this science as chiefly practical and related to ordering a finite number of ends and means. The ends and means studied must be finite, because moral action is moved by choice of the actual, by what is possible to do. As a result, you can't have an infinite number of ends. If you did, they'd wind up being an infinite number of means, and a means to nothing, strictly speaking, which couldn't cause you to move, because it would be, you couldn't choose to do it because choices of the possible, not the impossible. It's a reaction to natural desire that is reactive to an external stimulus, drawing a subject toward union with it. The study has to belong to the supremely architectonic science, politics, because politics is, in practical science, the science of performance activity par excellence. It naturally rules over all of the other productive activities. The order of performance science is consequent upon the order of natural needs and natural inclinations. Therein leisure sciences, sciences that satisfy wants, are subordinated to sciences that fulfill chief natural needs. More than any other performance science, political science deals chiefly with fulfilling human needs first and foremost, and dictates to other practical sciences specification of exercise. It commands their use and their skill on what specific activities they can be put to use. For example, to make swords, or to with respect to military production. So, political science is the highest performance science. The productive sciences are chiefly directed toward making tools for the exercise of these human activities, which develop the perfection of human faculties. And it's what we choose, strictly speaking, as I mentioned before, is never a thing, never a tool, never a substance, this or that. It's always a relationship or an activity. And as a result, human actions that are generated through our faculties are the chief concern of all human choice and perfection of those, of the order of operations of those, for securing our most fundamental natural human needs. Regarding speculative sciences, political sciences, St. Thomas and Aristotle say, can dictate for some people to teach and to learn, for example, for geometry to be put to military purposes or use, but it can't dictate the specification of the science of geometry or what conclusions it has to draw, at least not strictly speaking from the political art or the political science. Specification of the science is derived from habits essentially related to the geometrical whole. Just like any science derives its principles from the habits related to the whole, the composite whole that it's studying. Political science, St. Thomas says, uses the art of legislation to command and contain the ends of other practical sciences. Such a study of many states for the good of many populations is the generic subject of ethics. It's more perfect than just a study of individual behavior or domestic behavior. It includes a study of all of these as parts of it. Still, St. Thomas claims that the subject that studies the ultimate end of the whole universe considered as such, namely metaphysics, is a higher science still. After considering in Lesson 2 the chief good with which ethics deals, in Lesson 3 St. Thomas analyzes what Aristotle says about the qualities that students and teachers of the science have to have and the method of study proper to this science. On the part of students and teachers, he said, the method proper to manifesting truth in any science should be suitable to the subject matter studied. Different subjects require different methods to make their essential whole-part relations known. Ethics chiefly studies human acts, internal and external, acts of virtue. The external dealing with enabling means of executing virtue. Politics chiefly studies just acts, external acts enabling the means for doing just acts. Both study circumstances and conditions under which moral activities are performed. Because the subject matter is somewhat variable, contingent, the method of study has to be somewhat variable, has to be somewhat contingent. It cannot generate the same quality of certainty as matters involving matters not involving contingency, just as in contemporary physics. The method involved must reason from what is true for the most part to singulars, because moral science studies acts generated by the will as moved by what appears to be good in contingent and variable circumstances. Moral conclusions include individual circumstances as part of their very nature. Now, many people might find this puzzling because they are so familiar with the notion that Aristotle says that science is of the universal. This is true, it's of the universal, which ethics includes. But this doesn't mean it doesn't study the singular. Aristotle maintains that the study of science involves the study of the singular. Essentially, that's where you abstract the universal relations about which you make judgments, except that in practical sciences you move from the universal principle to application in the individual circumstance. How do you apply the universal principle being your habit, being the causal universal, in the sense that you are trying to figure out how does this universal power generate in this individual circumstance this action that I want to perform. So Aristotle says you can't get the same amount of certainty in this kind of a science, and strictly speaking, it's not as scientific as metaphysics, but it does give a high degree of certainty when based upon habitual practice, and so it can give you a level of necessity, a quality of necessity, which Aristotle analogously will say qualifies as being philosophical or scientific. The same thing with respect to modern mathematical physics. Regarding students and teachers of this science, Aristotle claims A man educated in one particular subject can judge well about what belongs to the subject. A man educated in all subjects can judge well about all of them. That is, we judge well about that with which we are familiar, well, what we know. If we have no experience, then we don't tend to be good judges about things. So he says young people, incontinent people, people who can't restrain their emotions, emotionally immature people, people who lack emotional self-control, cannot achieve much advance in moral science, which is useful only for people who start off with the ability to control their appetites, their emotions. Young people are short on practical experience in general, but the moral induction from which moral science starts essentially involves practical experience. The different orders that we study, the different habits that we use as qualities of soul by means to apprehend the internal organizations involve different methods of induction. Some are simply observational. Some require that you work on the material, like painting and sculpture, because they involve the different modes of abstraction. Some involve just looking at one example. Some involve just looking at one thing, depending upon the intensity of the intelligence of the knower. Young people are not well qualified for this science. People who are slaves to their emotions, lack prudence, and inclined to choose the pleasurable over the real good. Such people cannot secure a chief good at which moral science aims, which is ending enslavement to the emotions, so that we can live harmoniously and peacefully with other people as part of a community. Both young people and the emotionally immature, the habitually and morally vicious, are defected in the needed maturity development of cogitative reason to induce the first principles of this science. They lack experience of being able to know the natures of the things they're studying and their own natures, which makes them qualified to make choices about the right things to do in the individual circumstances. To such people, moral science, Aristotle says, is useless. It's very useful, however, to people who have a knowledge of moral matter, that is, they can induce their first principles. They can know the organizations with which they're dealing and the part-whole relationships that are essential to generate the actions of those organizations, who possess emotional self-control and who can execute external acts under the command of right reason, that is, under prudence. This is the end of Aristotle's introduction to the Nicomachean Ethics and of St. Thomas's first three lessons dealing with that. And it begins lesson 4, where Aristotle says that begins a treatise on happiness in 3 parts. One that investigates the supreme good, happiness, and concludes that happiness is an activity flowing from virtue. He'll come back in lesson 19 to study happiness in more detail, that is St. Thomas, as a kind of operation according to perfect virtue. In Book 10, Aristotle talks about what sort of operation and of what nature this is. As far as St. Thomas's lesson 4 is concerned, in it he starts by talking about Aristotle's investigation about happiness as made by others, how the many and other Platonists consider happiness, how others, Platonists consider happiness. He says the many tend to think that happiness is something apparent, obvious, sensible pleasures, riches, honors, and the like. And the reason that they do so, this is the view of the many, is because the many are not habituated or trained to consider goods higher than pleasurable goods. They are not inclined to be as the few tend to be courageous and temperate in behavior. They're not inclined to think abstractly, to reason abstractly. So what they do is they tend to identify the good, the highest goods, with what they know. The Platonists, he says, the many, he says, tend to think that happiness lies in these things. They tend to disagree about which one of these external goods, or this internal good of pleasure, is happiness. And they consider happiness to be nothing fixed as a result, relative, what is most desired depending upon what a person most lacks at the time. So if you're poor, it lies in riches. If you're weak, it's going to lie in strength, and so forth. The Platonists, he says, considered happiness to be a good separate from all sensible goods. He'll give a criticism of the Platonists. I'm not going to go into that because it's not relevant to our own period of time, or needed to know to understand the subject with which Aristotle is concerned. St. Thomas then talks about Aristotle's method for studying the opinions of others. He says, you use the method of effect to cause, reasoning according to a type of argument quia, Q-U-I-A in Latin. In demonstration, it's called demonstratio quia. In practical matters, where effects are better known to us, that's different from reasoning propter quid, where the cause is better known. In considering the different opinions that people have about happiness, Aristotle maintains it would be useless for a good philosopher to go over all of these, for some of them are irrational. So, but some of the opinions are useful. Some appear to be probable, based upon the observation of causes, of effects and causes, and are held by custom by many people. In moral matters, this reasoning from effect to cause starts by taking as a principle that something is so. For example, that fasting restrains concupiscence. And then you try to figure out why. What's the cause? To know the reason why, we have to recognize that there are certain principles involved that we discover through experience from someone else or from working with the material. That's why people who are engaged in mathematical physics put such an emphasis on experimentation as the only method of induction, because this is the type of method of induction that's used in this type of study. But if you're involved in theoretical and speculative ways of knowing, that type of induction is not appropriate. It's not necessary. In Lesson 5, St. Thomas examines different opinions about happiness. He starts with Aristotle's consideration of an opinion of some men that Aristotle deems reasonable and probable, that happiness is a good belonging to this life and consists of one of three types of life. The life of pleasure, the public life, the cultural life, that is, or contemplation. The eminent people and upright people, like the Epicureans, for example, in Aristotle's time, considered pleasure to be a happiness, part of the essential nature of happiness, and so it's not something that should just be dismissed as not having truth, some truth in it. Men of culture, he says, of refinement, considered public life to be a highest good. And those who love speculation consider contemplation to be the highest good. About those who identify happiness with pleasure, St. Thomas says, they identify happiness with intense pleasure, and he's following Aristotle here. Pleasures in eating and drinking and sex, for the most part. They fix their end on the same end that even pigs, dumb animals, enjoy, according to Aristotle. They identify happiness with something that cannot possibly be specifically human, and they justify their choice sometimes by appeal to the fact that unbridled pursuit of pleasure is something pursued by powerful people. Most people make this threefold division of happiness because, according to Aristotle, three kinds of real good exist. The pleasurable, the useful, and the honorable, or the perfective, the virtuous good. Happiness cannot consist in honor, according to Aristotle, because happiness should exist preeminently in a person, and be hard to remove. But honor exists more in the giver than the receiver, and men seek honor to confirm for themselves their own good from sound judges. They seek to have the good opinion of themselves certified by people they consider to be sound judges. They seek honor from prudent men for their virtue, to be honored for their virtue. Hence, what they actually are seeking honor is virtue more than honor. Happiness cannot consist, however, in virtue, because people possess virtue even when asleep. And happiness consists in perfection of activity, or when they lack the opportunity to exercise. Virtue is another circumstance in which people can possess virtue. So happiness cannot consist in this, according to Aristotle. Happiness cannot consist in useful goods, because useful goods are coercively liked goods. The only reason we like them is because we need them as means to doing, for being able to exercise human action. Once again, as I've said, the only two possible objects of human choice are human relationships and human activities, and what we are choosing when we are choosing external goods, strictly speaking, is a relationship to those goods, so we can activate these internal operations. So it's impossible for external goods to be the chief aim or end of human life, namely happiness. And we had been discussing happiness, where St. Thomas had been talking about Aristotle's Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and was on lesson 5. And I'm skipping several lessons, going up to lesson 10, where he continues the discussion on happiness. He also discusses it a bit in lesson 9, but that's incorporated, the topics he discusses there. In subsequent things he says, so because there's so much material and so little time to get it done in a reasonable manner, I'm going to jump ahead to lesson 10, where St. Thomas talks about Aristotle defining happiness, and doing so in relationship to habit and custom, because we get our practical principles of practical experience from the behavior of things, and because so many people are familiar with living life, that to rule out things that are said by the many, and as well as by the philosophers, by people who have lived lives that involve intellectual pursuits also, would be, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, unreasonable. And Aristotle says that common agreement exists by custom, that the best of things, the ultimate end and the self-sufficient good is what happiness concerns. He gives, or you can define happiness as the best of things, the ultimate end, the best and self-sufficient good. Need for further precision, however, is required, and so Aristotle begins to do this, having somewhat started with its genus, and he wants to identify its specific difference. He shows its genus more precisely by identifying its organizational activity. The action of the whole nature of the human person, the action of all the facultative powers that they cooperate to generate. Because once again, Aristotle looks at everything in the finite universe as a composite whole. So when identifying the genus, he's identifying the organizational whole, like the members of the crew all together rowing, the members of the army engaged in fighting an enemy. The final good of everything is its ultimate perfection, and we should look to this when we're trying to define happiness. The form, according to Aristotle, is its first perfection, it doesn't. This is the beginnings of its organizational completeness. Its formal operation as a whole is its ultimate perfection, where actually the organizational composite, the corporate body and so forth, reaches its maturity and can exercise its act. Once again, people who are chiefly involved in engineering or in mathematics and so forth, that's not their chief concern, action. Their chief interest, their chief concern is in understanding what puts an organization together and gives it its unity. As far as the operations go, those become secondary. That's why people who tend to identify science with mathematics have little concern with ends, purposes, aims. They think none of these are real, that none of these have anything to do with science. Well, they don't have anything to do with respect to the ultimate goal that they seek in their investigations, which is simply to understand how things are put together. But how they operate, once put together this way or that way, that is a concern for many arts and sciences, as well as for organizations of different sorts, like businesses, military organizations, political organizations. So the form of a thing is its first perfection, but its operation as a whole is its ultimate perfection, because forms incline to generate wholes for the chief aim of operating, acting. Happiness is man's perfect operation, the perfect operation of human nature. Each part of a composite whole has a proper operation, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, and even incidental human acts have a proper operation, even if they have no relationship to happiness. They're put together in a definite way. The proper operation of living parts and a living whole is a living operation. The proper living operation of a living whole is not that of any one part, any more than the operation of the crew or of the army is that of any one part. It's the coordinated, the harmonious action of all its parts through coordination by a topmost part, much like an orchestra leader, that has to harmonize all of the parts to cooperate because they have an inclination, just by their natures, to somewhat to be resistant to perfect unity, which consists in an organization and harmonization. In human beings, the rational soul is human nature's first perfection. This soul, this principle of life, has two parts. One which is rational by nature, and one rational by participation, namely the appetites, the emotions, which the ancient Greeks at times called irrational parts of the soul. Aristotle considers both of them to be rational, but one by nature, one by participation. And so does St. Thomas. Happiness as man's highest activity according to Aristotle, likely consists in the act that is rational by nature, because it's reason that understands order. And the happy human life is the well-ordered life, it's the well-managed life, and so forth. Happiness then consists in an activity of soul in accord with reason. Getting down to further specification of it. Since happiness is the act of a superlatively good man, it must consist in acting well in a superlative way according to reason, an act of highest virtue. It's our highest end, our highest act. As happiness requires the product of a highest virtue habit, as happiness is the product of a highest virtue or habit, happiness requires continuity and perpetuity, continued repetition of good deeds throughout the whole of a person's life according to the best of a person's ability, virtue, moral virtue. Having finished giving a sketch of happiness in lesson 10, a general description that looks like happiness, a good description. In lesson 11, St. Thomas starts to report about what Aristotle says to move beyond the good description to an exact definition. He starts to talk about the importance of learning from predecessors, of repeated study. Then he talks about the proper method of practical science is to study the natures of things for their utility, not to understand their natures exhaustively, and to seek to identify the causes as such, that this or that is the cause. The chief aim is not to get at an understanding of what is true, but the chief aim is to be able to make right choices, to perform good deeds. Different sciences induce the principles with which they start their reasoning in different ways. I've mentioned this a few times already in different classes we've had and just previously in this class. Some of these principles are induced, according to Aristotle, from examples, like in mathematics, or like you can give a historical example, or you can give. Plato does this repeatedly. He gives a fictional example, an example from myth, and so forth, or from a real situation. From observing the behavior of things, for example, that every living body needs food. By custom, Aristotle reports how we can discern that fasting decreases the appetites. By experimentation in practical activities like painting and sculpture, and in mathematical physics, for example. Now, the chief aim of engaging in induction is to get at the principles, the starting points of knowledge, the per se notum, truth, something which we know, from which we can then engage in solid reasoning. So Francis Bacon was right with respect to indicating that wrong induction at the start cannot help in engaging in science. If you mistake science to be identical with logic, because logicians have to presuppose some sort of induction, some sort of knowledge. He was wrong in trying to reduce the whole of induction to the kind of technologically restrained induction that he conceived it to be. As St. Thomas says, the whole of a science is contained in its principles, as Aristotle also said. And one principle, well understood and completely thought out, answers many questions we seek to answer in science. Now, what we're chiefly getting by that induction is an understanding of the whole, how the parts and the whole cooperate to generate action. That is, if the induction relates to an operational organization. In lesson 12, this definition of happiness is confirmed by reference to other opinions, showing that Aristotle's definition agrees with everything other people have said. Confirming the definition of happiness given in Lecture 10 is what he then engages in Lesson 12. Some investigations, according to St. Thomas, proceed from principles. Thoroughly understanding principles at the start is crucial for the best hope of success in the end. I'm sorry, since investigations start this way, not some. But some investigations do not start that way, unfortunately. And it's the ones that proceed on the right foot that do so. In practical matters, because it generates all other acts which are performed to cause it, the ultimate end, the last act, is the first principle. It's the last thing that you want to do because you know that this completes the action that you first set out to do. For example, you want to get to Albany, New York. That's the what you chiefly want to do. That's the last act. That becomes the principle for your movement. To ensure more careful study, we have to examine, according to Aristotle, premises and conclusions in our reasoning, to make sure all our reasoning harmonizes with the truth. We, in addition, have to consider observations by others about the principle itself. Now, the reason that we have to consider whether the premises and conclusions harmonize and the observations of others, what they make, is because we achieve the good only in concurrence of all factors pertaining to the perfection of a composite whole, of a whole thing. Even false opinions help in this process because evil mistakes arise in many ways through defect in one part, but no mistake exists that in some way does not apprehend the good or the true, doesn't reflect it, because evil falsehood is known through reference to the good, to the true. That's how we know it's evil or false. To carry out the stated goal, to examine the opinions of others in relation to his definition, St. Thomas says Aristotle divides human goods into three species: external, like riches, honors, and friends, and internal, which he divides into two parts: psychological and bodily. Psychological, like knowledge and virtue, and bodily, like physical strength, beauty, and health. The next, St. Thomas says that these three species are the chief human goods. External things exist for the sake of the body, like instruments servicing its good, matter to form, like productive activity, manufacturing, to performance art. Internal bodily goods exist for the good of the soul, so performance activities in which we engage, staying alive and so forth, is chiefly for psychological reasons, so we can become happy, live well. We don't psychologically exist for the perfect health of the body. The body exists for our psychological well-being as humans. We are more than our bodily or even our mental part, but the good of the whole person is the chief aim, and chiefly the perfection of the faculties of the soul. The common teaching of all the philosophers is that the good of the soul is most important. So Aristotle claims that his teaching, that happiness is an activity of soul, conforms to the teaching of the ancient philosophers. Moreover, he states that the soul has two species of operation: imminent, performance, activities, and transient, production. Transient operations are never ultimate ends. Once again, they're always instrumental means servicing imminent operations. The only reason we like them, the only reason we seek after them, is so that they can be part of the relationship. Because we like to drive, because we like to drive as a human activity, we like cars. It's not the other way around, because we like to see. We like beautiful things to look at. If we didn't like the act of seeing in the first place, the beautiful things perfect our ability to see qualitatively. So happiness, according to St. Thomas and Aristotle, must be an immanent operation. This conclusion agrees with what everyone tends to agree is happiness, living a good life. Even the points regarding happiness about which other philosophers disagree, according to Aristotle, support his teaching. Some philosophers say, in three different ways, that happiness consists in virtue. Some say it consists in any virtue, but especially moral virtue, which is the appetite under control of reason. Some say it consists in prudence, which perfects practical reason. Some say it consists in wisdom, which perfects speculative reason. Any or all of these, plus pleasure, according to Aristotle, constitute happiness. Virtue and happiness, almost equal in measure, compose happiness. Happiness lies chiefly in virtue and secondarily in pleasure is another possibility. Or happiness lies in almost equal measure between them, or in chiefly in virtue and secondarily in pleasure, but also in a full measure of external goods. But Aristotle maintains it has to include pleasure as part of its definition, as well as prudence. The common people and some ancients hold that some of these opinions, such as pleasures, riches, being needed for happiness, and a minority of distinguished men hold happiness consists in goods of the soul. Aristotle claimed that the likelihood to be that none of these teachings was totally wrong. Some were right on some points, and all of these teachings to some extent agree with his definition, but his definition is more complete. Aristotle shows his definition is better from the standpoint of reason, because virtuous operation is more perfect than possession of virtue, because virtue by nature inclines toward perfect operation and acts its end. From customary speech, Aristotle makes reference to this phrase, at the Olympic Games, only those who participate, only those who compete, run the race, win the prize. Of those who are good and best in virtuous activity, only those who perform good deeds are illustrious and happy. The chief aim or end for engaging in habits to possess the qualities of virtue is to excel at operation, to do that which perfects the faculty, which by nature, natural inclination, we tend to do. Lesson 13 confirms Aristotle's definition in relation to those who claim virtue consists in that happiness consists in virtue and pleasure. Aristotle proves his claim by doing the following. He says that we attribute pleasure only to beings having perception, to animals, and to activities of soul, and we attribute pleasure only to exist in union with what we love, what we find agreeable. By nature, virtue pleases all human beings because we all seek and delight in perfect natural operation. We enjoy the faculty of sight, the faculty of hearing. There's a natural pleasure just in their exercise. So long as we're sensing, we're always experiencing this natural pleasure. So Aristotle maintains it's impossible for us to divorce the act of pleasure from happiness. This doesn't mean that he's advocating some sort of hedonism. He's not. The pleasures commonly pursued by human nature are as real and not apparent. as goods naturally pleasant to people with an uncorrupted soul are the kinds of pleasures he's talking about, and these are revealed by prudence through connection with cogitative reason, the operation of cogitative reason. The pleasures in which the many delight are contrary to each other and to that of prudence, because they relate to the apparent goods of the concupiscible appetite, like hoarding and squandering money. The concupiscible appetite doesn't recognize the real needs of the nature of the thing, as well as the real needs of the human being. By nature, human beings have a difficult time being wrong about being hungry, or being wrong about not being able to breathe, being wrong about being sick, which are kinds of activities that are revealed by the irascible emotions and not by the concupiscible. The fact that you don't feel good, you'll experience on the level of the concupiscible appetite, but the fact that you're sick, and that's why that there's some sort of natural defect related to this, it's not something the concupiscible appetite reveals. And that's why you have to go toward that appetite in which prudence is seated on the sense level, to understand the real goods and real evils that can be coordinated as means to the end of happiness, and how they have to regulate these other emotions. The pleasures loved by men of virtue essentially relate to naturally higher pleasures of the soul, to fulfilling real needs of human nature regarding species and individual preservation and perfection, possessing the real good, that which is really needed, doing naturally good acts. The pleasures loved by vicious men, he says, are acquired through habitual use of corrupt habits, result from habitual exercise of imprudent choices, and are not delightful by healthy natural inclination. The virtuous life needs no external pleasure to delight it. Only operations of its virtue are needed to give it pleasure. The proof that the virtuous life is pleasurable considered in itself consists in the fact that pleasure necessarily belongs to virtue. It pertains to its nature. No virtuous person exists who does not enjoy, doesn't delight in doing virtuous deeds. This is the case not only with respect to moral activity, it also exists with respect to professions. The person who no longer enjoys engaging in the activity in which that person is possessed of some exceptional skill has reached the time when it's time to give it up, to go somewhere else, to do something else, because you're losing your virtue, you're losing the power, that intensive quantum quality, intensive quality that is part of the essence of a virtuous activity, whether it's theoretical or practical, productive, moral, and so on. The reason for this is that the act of the virtuous person issues from a proper habit, a habit directed by prudence, especially in the case of moral activity, because that's its essential nature, but even in other professional activities, because you have to know when or not to execute your professional expertise. The act of virtue, according to St. Thomas and Aristotle, is noble or beautiful by nature because of the fitting arrangement of its parts. It's good because it's ordered to a faculty's end, the perfection of facultative operation. In other words, virtue is a beautiful quality of soul that generates beautifully exercised operations that are apprehensible as pleasing to those who recognize the kind of organizational whole with which they relate. So that this is induced when a person who has this habit it comes into experience of that kind of organizational whole. Recognize the beauty, the harmonization, the order that is present in the parts. And people who are unfamiliar with that kind of subject matter do not recognize it, they cannot see it. The more you have expertise in the area, the more you recognize that the principles that you seek through induction are acts of beautification. Pleasure, beauty, and goodness belong to virtuous actions in a high degree, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas. And the proof of this is the good person who considers them in this way so much that he or she prizes them higher than any other pleasures. Since happiness consists in virtuous actions, happiness is, according to Aristotle, the best, the most pleasant, and most beautiful of actions. Happiness is the one act generated by perfect possession of moral virtue as a cooperative act. He proves his definition, that is Aristotle, of happiness against those who claim it consists in possession of external goods by saying happiness chiefly consists in virtuous activity. Essential to it at times are external goods, because of the need for the right instrument and also for right circumstances and circumstances like good luck. But they are not the essential and crucial elements to it. They are essential as enabling means, but not internally to the activity. The cause of happiness, according to Aristotle, must be per se and determined, or incidental and by chance, for those who want to argue against him. If it's per se, if it exists as part of its essence, then the cause of happiness must be divine or human, because it's the greatest of human goods. It's either caused by God or it's caused by some sort of perfection in the human person. It's got, if it's caused humanly, it's got to exist in speculative learning, moral practice, or some sort of drill like is achieved in military activity. Regarding whether happiness is divinely caused, St. Thomas replies, because it's the most excellent of human goods, this is eminently reasonable. Higher beings and higher virtues lead lower beings and lower virtues. Such a consideration is proper to metaphysics, however, so he's not going to dwell on it here. While God is the chief cause of happiness by creating its nature, human beings contribute to happiness in two ways. It's the reward or end of virtue, something most excellent, divine, blessed, and godlike. If happiness is the end of human nature, it must be achievable by all humans. It doesn't consist in communication with separate substances, and it's not achieved through chance. Chance can't cause happiness because nature produces what is suitable for its agents to achieve their ends, by inclining the being toward its end. It's the nature of a thing, the form of a thing, is producing the enabling means, as well as if an external agent is involved in this, those means have to be supportive of it. If chance were the cause of the most perfect of all human goods, the pursuit of all of the goods, according to St. Thomas, would collapse as irrational. They would have no rational sense to them. Evident from the preceding inquiry to Aristotle is that happiness is an activity of the rational soul in accord with virtue, influenced by some divine cause, and what happens according to reason doesn't happen by chance. Of course, St. Thomas agrees with this. Happiness springs proximately from a human cause and from God as a first cause. While other goods play a part in causing happiness, happiness doesn't chiefly consist in them. It's enhanced by some of them. It's instrumentally helped by others. It's the end of political science. Political science especially is concerned with framing laws and apportioning rewards and punishment to make good citizens and doers of good works. Irrational animals and children cannot be, strictly speaking, be happy, according to Aristotle, because neither can share in the activity of the perfect virtue that demands best operation and continuous permanent good action, which is essential to the kind of happiness he's talking about, which is happiness in this life. In lesson 15, St. Thomas goes on to explain or discuss Aristotle's answer to Solon's problem about whether anyone can be called happy in this life due to changes in future fortune. At any time in life, bad fortune can beset us like it did Priam, King Priam. And because happiness should be permanent, not easily changeable. For several reasons, Aristotle rejects this claim that we can only judge a person to be happy at death, because since death is the worst of evils and happiness is the greatest of goods, it would be unreasonable to maintain that they coincide. That's only when you die that you achieve the kind of happiness that he's talking about. Happiness is a kind of activity, and the dead appear not to have any activity and to suffer a loss of consciousness, and they can't be affected by good and evils that happen related to them after they die. Aristotle solves Solon's problem by showing that while external goods subject to fortune are essential to the performance and perfection of virtuous action, virtuous actions are the principal and predominant factors causing human happiness. We properly call people virtuous because they act virtuously. Being material and corporeal by our nature, external and internal bodily goods are subject to change in us and in things independently, other physical things. Goods belonging to the soul are changeable only indirectly because, according to St. Thomas, the soul is immortal and it's immaterial. So bodily goods are not going to affect and change it. Moral goods, moral virtues are longer lasting than intellectual virtues and more fixed by frequent practice. Because we have moral goods from the very start, that is goods related to pleasure, and trying to control them through parental correction, for example, much longer than we have experience of speculative goods. This is why Aristotle first studies moral virtue before intellectual virtue. Among virtues, the most noble and beautiful seem more intense, reasonably, because they are, as I've said before, intensive quantities. They are qualities. And they seem to last longer because of the fact that they are more intense and practiced more. They are generated by the needs for us to protect ourselves individually and then to protect the species, the human species. Moral virtue appears to last longer because it consists chiefly in appetitive acts, not destroyed by forgetfulness. It consists in those acts by which we seek to maintain our existence and to protect our life, both as individuals and members of the human species. If happiness consists in moral virtues that exist in human appetites that protect and preserve human life on a daily basis by constantly fulfilling natural needs, happiness, according to Aristotle, can last a lifetime. It's demanded that we repeat these actions on a daily basis. The happy man will act always or almost always according to virtue in everything he or she does. He will bear misfortunes admirably, be eminently prudent in all matters, be perfect in all the cardinal moral virtues. good and bad fortune will not tend to affect the happy person, because short runs of good and bad luck not change. Are not going to change life as a whole, from or happiness to misery, or conversely. And great and frequent runs of good luck make life happier. Of bad luck will cause external annoyance and internal affliction, sorrow, that hinder external good works. Still, virtue makes good use even of bad luck, enabling the strength that is found in the good of virtue to shine forth gracefully in courageous people and magnanimous endurance of great suffering. So the reason that we find human beings who suffer bad fortune and consider them to be possessed of, to be great-souled, to be noble, is not because, according to Aristotle, as the Stoics held, such a person feels no sorrow. It's the way that the person reacts to the sorrow with a kind of great quality of soul. In fact, all of the virtues, to some extent, all of the moral virtues, all of the virtues, as I've said, because they are intensive quantities, are, in one way or another, qualities of being great-souled. Unlike the Stoics, who consider external bodily things not humanly good, Aristotle maintained that sadness affects the virtuous man appetitively and intellectually. It does not overwhelm his reason. The virtuous man's prudential reason moderates the effects of sadness. Madness, like death, can cause cessation of virtue, or some other, similar psychological disorder can do the same thing. But if virtuous actions dominate in the life of a happy man, the happy man, or as human being is what he's talking about, the happy man will not become unhappy due to misfortune or perform vicious acts because of it. The happy person will bear all changes of fortune, even those like born by Priam, becomingly, beautifully, like a truly good and wise man would act according to virtue, and in every condition according as the circumstances, conditions, and the materials permit. As we would say, this person would be a person of class. An appropriate term, it's indicating that the person somehow has generic perfection, or in this case, specific perfection. Conversely, the vicious man can never be happy, no matter what fortune brings. Like Cephalus had said to Socrates regarding whether old age is a difficult time or not. And Cephalus says, well, it depends upon character. In which case, youth or old age become miserable to the person who's got bad habits of soul. Aristotle concludes about happiness that nothing stops us from calling happy a man who acts in accord with perfect virtue, who acts prudently, and has sufficient external goods to act virtuously for a long time. In the most perfect sense possible, a happy man will live the life just described and die prudently. This is the sense in which Solon was talking about, according to St. Thomas, when talking about happiness. Since natural desire cannot be in vain, Aristotle adds that perfect happiness is reserved for men of perfect virtue in the afterlife. Regarding change of fortune and regarding friends, Aristotle compares the fortunes of those that happen to a man himself, and says fortune that beset a friend affect their friends. To conclude otherwise appears wrong because it's contrary to the nature of friendship and common opinion or custom. He talks more about this issue of the fortune of friends and how happiness affects the dead. And St. Thomas covers it in lesson 17. But we pretty much already covered that, so I'm not going to go into detail about it. In lesson 18, St. Thomas considers Aristotle's discussion about what causes happiness to be a good deserving of honor and praise. And Aristotle starts to answer this question by distinguishing definitions of honor and praise. Honor, he says, signifies manifesting a person's excellence by word and deed. Praise consists only of words. While praise and honor are given due to some excellence, two kinds of excellence exist. Absolute excellence, and to this honor is due in relation to some end, and to this praise is due. So it's in the pursuit of excellence that we engage in acts of praise chiefly. Because it's of the genus of perfect and best things, Aristotle says, happiness is of the genus of things to be honored. We praise human beings for virtue of mind and power and strength of body. We praise the person and the habit because they are ordered to the work of virtue. But something absolutely praiseworthy is praiseworthy under all circumstances. Praise is given to things whose goodness is considered in relation to something else within a genus. But the best of things are not ordered to anything better. So the best in the genus is honored. That's to be honored. Other things are ordained to them. Hence the end is to be honored. The means are praiseworthy or not praiseworthy. Happiness is a good, therefore, to be honored, something better than praise that exists for the best. And virtue is a good to be praised as an enabling means for securing happiness. Having finished discussing happiness, to which Aristotle will return in Book 10, he starts to discuss virtue and its relationship to happiness. He does this because since happiness is activity in accord with perfect virtue, we cannot fully comprehend happiness without fully comprehending virtue. Because its chief aim is to produce good citizens, citizens who obey the law, political science needs to study virtue. To study virtue and happiness, political science needs to study the soul. Because in a person, the soul is the virtue-generating principle. Virtue is the happiness-generating principle. Just as the medical doctor must study the virtue of the body, that is health, the statesman must study the virtue of the soul. Recall how Aristotle uses this term virtutus and also habitus when we first started to talk about the nature of a habit and the way we covered this distinction. Like just as the body has a kind of habitus or virtue in its health and in its beauty. And Plato will talk about how there's the virtue of a horse and the virtue of an eye. There's a kind of internal level of intensive quantity perfection that a thing possesses in terms of possessing a faculty. So the soul must be studied relative to virtues and to human actions because the soul is their proximate generator. They grow out of the soul. Finally, Aristotle divides the soul relative to the production of virtue into rational and irrational. I talked about this already. To the rational by nature and irrational by participation. And then he starts to go into a subdivision, and St. Thomas talks about this in lesson 20, about the vegetative part of the soul as being one of the irrational parts of the soul, which is in all animals and is not related to ethics. And the sensory part of the soul, which is rational by participation, which somewhat opposes reason, especially in incontinent men, he says, and inclines to follow reason in any way in anyone endowed with moral virtue. Moral reason is not related to the emotions like intellectual reason, he says, is related to intellectual habits like logic. Moral reason works like a father giving guidance, like friends giving advice, like reproach coming from superiors, and entreaties coming from inferiors. Reason is not, since reason is not governed by the motions of the heavens, and is not directly subject to the command of the emotions. He observes, and he divides the moral habits, the virtues, as praiseworthy according to the division of the soul. Aristotle chiefly studies virtues in two parts. In books 2 to 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he studies moral virtues. Book 2, he studies the genus, which we're going to consider in our next lesson, in our next lecture. And books 3 to 5 deal with its species. In book 6, he starts to consider intellectual virtues. So it's finished. All right, been a long class. These both parts, but I think I hope that you'll find that worthwhile. And I'm sorry for the numerous times that I have to look down at my notes, but I'm coordinating all of these all of this information that I've gathered over decades and so forth, and trying to organize it into a new and proper understanding of what St. Thomas's teaching involves, what Aristotle was actually saying, and giving you a proper understanding of this teaching as a whole. And doing that all for the first time is kind of complicated, so I apologize for the need, but I'm no more than Rattler. Take care now. Have a good day.